Your heart cannot send a single drop of blood to your brain, your hands, or anyone you have ever touched until it has fed itself first. Before oxygen reaches any other part of you, it passes through a private set of vessels wrapped around the heart's own muscle. Skip that step, and the heart does not become more giving. It stops. Most people run their relationships on the opposite assumption, that loving someone else means starving yourself of that same regard first, as proof of how much you care. That is not virtue. It is a fundamental misunderstanding of how the mechanism actually works, and it produces exactly the exhaustion, resentment, and quiet manipulation we traced last time back to its root. What actually happens when something skips its own supply, and why nothing built on top of that shortage can outrun it, is what we're tracing here. Last time, dark psychology dating tactics traced back to one belief: that the real, unmanaged version of you is not enough to be chosen, so a constructed version has to do the work instead. Strip the tactic away, and what is left is the raw feeling underneath, the one every strategy in that video was quietly trying to manage. This is where that feeling actually gets resolved, not with a better tactic, a more convincing version of yourself, or advice about communication style. Self-love, in the sense used here, is not a mood or a mindset to talk yourself into on a good morning. It functions the way the heart's own blood supply functions, invisible when it is working, and the explanation for almost everything when it is not. There is very little in a human life that does not, on close inspection, run through this supply somewhere. Cardiologists call this coronary circulation. The heart pumps roughly 2,000 gallons of blood a day, and the very first branch off that entire output goes nowhere near the rest of the body. It curls back around the heart itself, feeding the muscle doing all the pumping, and what it feeds it with is not a leftover share. It is the richest, most oxygenated blood in the entire system, taken straight off the aorta before anything else has had the chance to draw from it. Only after that private circuit is satisfied does the rest of the blood get sent onward, to the lungs, the brain, the hands. There is no version of this where the heart sacrifices its own supply to send more somewhere else. If it tried, the muscle would fail within minutes, and it would fail everyone downstream of it at the same time. Picture a heart that decided feeding itself first was selfish, and redirected its own arteries outward instead, toward the lungs, the limbs, whoever needed blood most urgently. It would not become the most generous organ in the body. It would become the first one to fail, and it would take the rest of the system down with it. Seth describes the same structure at the level of identity rather than blood. You must first love yourself before you love another, not as a nice sentiment to open a self-help chapter with, but as a description of sequence. The self-regard has to be present before anything built on top of it. Patience, generosity, attention, desire can be sent anywhere else without draining the source dry. This is also where last video's tactics and this video's subject turn out to be the same starvation, dressed differently. Negging and manufactured scarcity are one way of trying to draw blood you do not have enough of. Overgiving is the other. Handing over your time, your opinions, your own needs again and again, on the unspoken assumption that enough giving will eventually be exchanged for the regard you were not generating internally in the first place. Both directions run on the identical shortage. One demands from the outside. The other tries to earn it by depleting the inside. Neither one reaches the source because the source was never the other person to begin with. Here is where the mechanism stops being abstract. There is a specific, common belief this collides with directly, that real love requires sacrifice, that giving something up proves how much you care. Picture a parent telling their grown child that they gave up their entire life for them, meant as the highest compliment they know how to pay. Examined honestly, it plays more like an accusation. It says, I did not build a life I actually wanted, and now you are responsible for making that worth it. The self does not grow by being handed away as a burden to someone else. It grows, or it does not. Giving itself up was never actually on the list of things it can do. There is also a distinction worth being precise about here. The difference between believing you are unworthy and actually being unworthy. which are not the same claim even though they get treated as interchangeable. One is a belief, formed early and rarely questioned since. The other would require evidence, examined honestly, the same way any other claim would. Most people spend years trying to disprove the second one to people who were never making that argument in the first place. The belief was never waiting for enough proof. It was waiting to be noticed as a belief rather than as a fact about who they are. Without that internal supply established first, a specific pattern shows up reliably, constantly asking other people what you should do, what you are worth, whether you are enough, and then quietly resenting the very people you keep asking. And this is easy to miss because it wears the mask of humility instead of manipulation. It looks like the opposite of what we covered last time. Underneath, it runs on the exact same fuel shortage as every tactic in that video. The question was never really being asked of them. There was simply nowhere else left to send it. And because no one else was ever actually capable of supplying it, their inevitable falling short gets quietly filed as a failure on their part, rather than as the predictable result of asking for something only one source could ever provide. There is one more piece of this worth sitting with. There is a reason for this that goes beyond willpower or better habits. You cannot know another person from a distance. It takes sustained, direct attention over time before anything like real love is possible. The same rule applies to yourself and gets skipped constantly. Most people know a great deal about what they do for other people, and remarkably little about what they actually feel, want, or fear, examined at that same close range. What gets loved instead is a rough outline, the version of you that gets things done, manages other people's opinions, and rarely gets asked what it actually wants. That outline is easy to approve of. It is just not actually you. There is an obvious objection to looking that closely, and it is worth naming directly. What if what gets found there is not likable? Love, at its most basic and functional level, has never required its object to be flawless. It is naturally creative and exploratory, capable of holding what looks like a fault and finding it a place in the larger pattern anyway, without needing to erase it first. Extended toward another person, this is considered ordinary, even admirable. Extended toward yourself, it tends to get mistaken for lowering your standards. It is the same mechanism either way. Withholding it from yourself specifically does not make you more honest about your own flaws. It just leaves one particular person permanently excluded from the kind of attention you already know how to give everyone else. Which brings the heart back into view. It does not feed itself first out of vanity. It feeds itself first because that is the only way the rest of the system gets fed at all, reliably, without collapse. For the 70 or 80 years it is asked to keep doing this. Self-love, in the sense this material points at, is not the reward for becoming a good enough person. It is closer to plumbing. Get the sequence backward, and everything built on top of it. Every relationship, every act of generosity, every attempt to be chosen, or to choose someone else, runs on a supply that was never actually there. There is a specific field within modern psychology built almost entirely around this same reversal, usually gathered under the heading of self-compassion. The general finding, echoed across a wide range of that research, runs against the old assumption almost point for point. Treating yourself with more warmth and less harsh judgment does not produce more selfishness or less motivation. It tends to produce more resilience and more genuine capacity for caring about others, not less. What this material adds underneath that finding is the mechanism producing it, not correlation, sequence. The internal supply has to exist before it can be extended outward, the same way blood has to reach the heart muscle before it reaches anywhere else. This also closes the loop on last video's projection mechanism. Projection only has fuel to work with when there is something disowned to project in the first place. Some quality in yourself you have not accepted, and therefore cannot bear seeing reflected back at you. Establish the internal supply first, and there is nothing left over to unconsciously assign to someone else, and nothing left over that needs managing through timed silence or manufactured scarcity either. The tactic and the quiet self-erasure were never really about the other person. They were both about the same unmet internal requirement, approached from two different directions. There is a simple private test for this, and it needs no relationship at all. The next time you make a small mistake with no one else around to witness it, notice the exact tone you use with yourself in that moment, not the version you would perform if someone were listening. The tone underneath that. That tone is the actual current state of the supply this whole video has been describing. If any of this changed how you would answer the question of giving versus withholding in your own life, that is worth saying in the comments. Patterns tend to loosen the moment they are actually named. Every tactic in the last video and every quiet act of self-erasure in this one turn out to be the same organ, starved of its own supply, trying to solve that shortage by rerouting outward instead of resupplying at the source. The relationship was never the mechanism doing the work, it was always the self-regard underneath it, feeding or failing to feed, everything built on top. 2 videos ago, this series opened by asking what a relationship actually chooses in you. Which side of your own personality gets room to grow and which stays dormant. The missing piece was always the same, regardless of which side got chosen. Was it being fed from the inside, or was it starving and hoping the relationship itself would notice and fix that? Of everything that determines whether any of that survives, this is the one thing everything else quietly depends on. Skip it, and every relationship becomes a more elaborate version of the same shortage. That shortage is not limited to love either. Think of the last time you pushed harder at something, a job, a creative project, a bank balance, specifically because some part of you did not yet trust it would come without the pushing. Here is the strange part. Forcing like that sometimes actually appears to work for a while. Why it works exactly long enough to convince you it is necessary and what that costs everywhere else is a different question, and one worth answering properly. So we'll do that in the next video.